Tonight's rally is hosted by the Brazil Solidarity Initiative and the Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, and it's supported by Arise, a festival of left ideas. As well as those of you taking part on Zoom, we are also streaming live to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and the discussion will also be available on the Arise Festival podcast once the rally is over. To introduce myself, I'm Celia Dignan, and I'm a member of Hornsey and Free and Barnet CLP, and I'll be chairing tonight's rally and celebration. We've got a really fantastic range of speakers here with us, including two guests who've recently visited Brazil to experience the progress of Lula's government firsthand. This time last year, Lula's election victory brought hope back to Brazil and inspired progressive activists, politicians, and movements around the globe. Lula showed that against all odds, we can fight back against the far right and that we can win. Since his inauguration in January, Lula's policies have already had a direct and positive impact on the lives of tens of millions of Brazilians. By reversing Bolsonaro's destructive agenda for the Amazon, Lula's government has massively reduced deforestation and shown itself to be an ally to those on the frontline defense of the Amazon, Brazil's indigenous communities and environmental activists. At the global level, Lula has been a voice for regional cooperation and for peace. And this was visible for all to see with Brazil's motion to the UN Security Council, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. While we celebrate the achievements of Lula's government, we must also continue to build solidarity in the face of far-right attacks. Last January, we witnessed a far-right mob backed by sections of the military storm Brazil's capital in an attempt to undermine the election. Our international solidarity is critical for the defense of Brazil's democracy, and we are proud to show our support for the movements for social progress, equality, and the environment in Brazil. I'd now like to move on to tonight's speakers, so we can hear about these issues in more depth. I hope you enjoyed tonight's webinar. First up, we have a quick message from Patrick Foley, one of the organisers of the Brazil Solidarity Initiative. Patrick has been doing solidarity work with Brazil since the coup against President Dilma Rousseff back in 2016. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Celia, and thanks so much for chairing this evening. And I just wanted to take a few minutes just to really emphasize how much of a positive and inspiring movement that we're seeing in Brazil. Just a year ago, we had very, very, very dark days. We had Bolsonaro in power. We had threats against the indigenous community. We had threats against the LGBT community. We had people being murdered in the Amazon. We had people being murdered by the military police. Unfortunately, that's still going on in some cases. We had this horrific pushback against all the progress made in the past 15 years under progressive governments, and even just a gradual shift towards equality and social progress in Brazil. And all of that was being rapidly rolled back. And what a difference a year makes. That election victory inspired progressive movements, activists, and politicians around the world. We saw Lula go from a prison cell, being politically persecuted and removed from the previous election, which Bolsonaro won, going all the way to becoming president. This is by far the most positive political campaign that I've ever been involved in. We see successes on the left, slightly rarely, unfortunately, in this side of the world. But to look over to Brazil and see such an inspiring victory should really be fuel for all of our fires as we continue to fight the important struggles and battles that we are today. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about the positive gains made by our speakers tonight. But from the environment to housing to health to education, we really are witnessing a return of some fantastic achievements in Brazil. So just wanted to thank you all for joining us. I know a lot of you will be supporters already, but just to make sure you follow us on all our social media channels, to become a supporter if you're not already. If you're a trade unionist, make sure to affiliate your branch or your region, and I'll be posting some links in the chat throughout. So just keep an eye on that from me, and thank you for joining us. So back to you, Celia. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And just to reiterate how important it is for people to join the campaign and to ask their union branch to join as well. So next, we're going to hear from Julia Felmanas, who is the coordinator of the Brazilian Workers' Party in London. Julia is in a great position to tell us about Lula's policies in more detail and also the challenges facing Lula's government today. Over to you, Julia.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the positives of the Lula government, but I think it's important, as Patrick said. Patrick basically mentioned the idea that the fact that the left can win, and Lula made an extraordinary comeback. But I think there's another thing that we need to see from what's happened in Brazil, not necessarily with Lula, but what happened in Brazil, which has to do with the rise of the far right. And the rise of where I first started to notice that something was wrong in the world when we had the car wash operations against President Lula and the whole idea of the anti-corruption, etc. I couldn't understand at the time why the world wasn't shouting about this as I believed it should. And then I suddenly started noticing that some of the language that we were using, or the far right was, or the right was using in Brazil, was also being used across the world, as we can see today. And now we find ourselves in a situation where we have an extreme right-wing murderous government in Israel, and the whole world is, well, not the whole world actually, but basically just the global north or the west is propping up that government and taking no notice to what's going on in politics and lining up everything in terms of being anti-Semitic or pro-Israel. And so we saw what happened in Brazil. Brazil was then we had Dilma Rousseff being removed from government. We had her vice taking over. He used an undemocratic period to pass in a number of authoritarian laws, destroying our labor laws, destroying, putting in some very restrictive measures in terms of our budget. So the Brazilian government wasn't able to spend on all the social side of things that it had to spend. Then that ushered in Bolsonaro. And like I said, Bolsonaro is not just a Brazilian phenomenon, but he's a phenomenon, is part of a phenomenon that's all over the world. And these are very, very difficult times, as we can see. And although Lula has won in Brazil, he won alone, in the sense that we have a very right-wing government. A very right-wing Congress in Brazil. So everything that Lula has to do needs to be negotiated with a very difficult Congress full of pro-agribusiness, right-wing, pro-militia, pro-arms, and religious Congress, each time more so with the elections that we've had so far. But having said that, Lula has spent all his time so far, the 10 months so far, because he was inaugurated on the 1st of January, rebuilding back all the social policies that he had developed throughout his years, him and President Dilma Rousseff. So he's put money back into the works that had been stopped in terms of infrastructure around the country. He's put money back into the housing policy that he had, also giving the poorest people on benefits the right to receive houses without having to pay installment. He's propped up his famous Bolsa Familia, where not only payments are much larger than they used to be, but now you have a much greater population. So you have, since Lula's been in government, 2.25 million people receiving Bolsa Familia. He's brought back the more doctors policy that he had, with bringing in already 21,000 new doctors. He's brought back free medication for the population. There's been reduction in the deforestation. I'm not going to go on about this, and all sorts of other policies in areas. Inflation is down to 3%. GDP is up to much higher expectations than everybody expected, at 3.4% for the last quarter. And he's managed to pass through tax reforms and a fiscal framework, which is quite controversial. So he's managed to do quite a lot in a very difficult situation. I just wanted to very quickly point out as well his foreign policy. And his foreign policy is something that's very important, both for his domestic policy, in the sense that a lot of what he wants to do needs to have the pressure from the outside, like, for example, all his environmental policies. The support that he doesn't get within the country, he receives or can receive from the outside, and also through the alliances that he makes. And it's also a policy in itself. And his foreign policy has got three main legs, which are very important. One of which we should take note, which is the reform of the international organizations. If we manage to push through reforms of the international organizations, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are at the moment, where we see we aren't able to pass any resolutions because of the USA, who decides not to back them, and situations like that. And Brazil has got the presidency until tomorrow of the Security Council, and did try to pass a resolution for peace, which wasn't accepted. The other thing that he talks about and wants to do is environmental, is dealing with the environment, but also linking with our social justice, both in terms of the poorer population of the world and the lack of equilibrium between countries, so that the poor countries don't bear the brunt of all the problems that the global north has caused. And the third area, which is very much keen on, is workers' rights, especially regarding the new type of work that we see, such as platform work, intermittent work, etc. This is something that Lula is taking to a global area. And one of the things that we have seen him doing is signing an agreement regarding labor rights with the American President Biden. So I think that's an overall view of what's been happening in Brazil. And like I say, everywhere, Lula is probably the most prominent voice for peace at the moment, in general terms, not just in relation to what's happening in Palestine. And he's also probably one of the most important spokesmen for the global South as well. I think I'll stop here, basically.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that important update. And it's a real reminder of what has been achieved in a very, very short period of time since January, in 10 short months, but in the face of difficult odds. And we don't underestimate the difficulties that Lula faces. So I'm now delighted to welcome our next speaker, who is Kim Johnson MP. Kim visited Brazil with a parliamentary delegation over the summer to witness the progress made by Lula's government firsthand. You're very welcome, Kim, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Celia, and good evening, everyone. And I would like to start by thanking Patrick and Brazil Solidarity for inviting me to speak at this rally tonight, celebrating 1 year since Lula's victory. And what a year has been, as we've already heard from Julia. But I'm really pleased to be on the platform with such esteemed speakers. But I did want to start by congratulating Brazil for its support for Gaza, in supporting the UN resolution for an immediate ceasefire. But I'm also very disappointed that the UK government abstained at the position of my own party. But I was very lucky to join the British group Interparliamentary Union cross-party delegation to Brazil, where I went in March this year, which was not long after Lula was inaugurated as the 39th president. And it was my first and hopefully not my last visit to Brazil. And I was very lucky to visit not one, but 3 cities. I went to Rio, Brasilia, and São Paulo. And prior to my visit to Brazil, Solidarity provided a very detailed briefing, highlighting some of the major issues, which helped me with my questioning of some of the stakeholders, because I did meet a diverse group of politicians, NGOs, and business leaders, including parliamentaries from the Brazilian IPU group. I met parliamentarians discussing sustainable development, traditional and indigenous peoples' human rights. I met with the Foreign Affairs and National Defence Committee on Foreign Trade. I met with the HMA to Brazil, with the Brazilian Agriculture Research Corporation, sector leads at the British Consulate, with a variety of parliamentarians, you know, to name but a few. So we had a very, very packed agenda. And given it was only 2 months since his inauguration, we hadn't really witnessed a lot of change at that point. But I think what was apparent during some of these meetings was that there are challenges for Lula, and there were stark inequalities and a threat, as has already been mentioned, from far-right violence and challenges to his leadership, as well as deeply divided political arena. But his vision for government, as we've heard, was bold, progressive, and strategic, but he faced major stumbling blocks, both domestically and internationally. And some of the Tory delegates that were with me were very critical over his stance on Ukraine, for example. However, despite accusations of making little progress after facing challenges from the catastrophic economic, labour, social and environmental situation left by 4 years of a far-right government under Bolsonaro and a very hostile political environment, Lula's first year has had some significant wins. In his first year of government, he's made some major strides with economic packages to support the lowest paid workers, which has boosted the economy and brought deflation to key commodities, including fuel, which is more than can be said for our own UK government. And he's been able to achieve and shows what he can do with a political agenda that prioritises the many, not the few. But before travelling to Brazil, I was very interested in finding out more about the food programme that Lula instigated to eradicate food hunger and extreme poverty when he was previously in power. And this is something I'm very passionate about, because as we know, the UK is the 5th richest economy in the world, and yet far too many children are going hungry. 4.2 million children go to school and go to bed every day with empty bellies. And I've been calling on the government and the Labour Party to roll out universal free school meal programme for all children. Sadly, without much success at the moment, but I'm really pleased to see that Lula has waged a war against hunger. after Brazil returned to the UN hunger map during the pandemic, after having left it in 2014, launching Brazil Without Hunger programme 2023. And you compare this with our own government and my party's refusal to roll out universal free school meals to children in England, with 11 children in a class of 30 living in poverty. You know, this is in work poverty, with more children being diagnosed with Victorian diseases. But I would have to say that the highlight of my visit to Rio was not only the Copacabana beach and Sugar Mountain, but visiting the Marielle Franco Institute and meeting with her sister, Anielle Franco, Brazil's racial equality minister. Because as a Black working class woman MP, we have a lot in common. Neither of us intended to become politicians, and we both grew up in areas where politicians rarely came from. And for both of us, racial and social justice is in our blood, and something that I've been passionate about since I was a teenager growing up in Liverpool, and it continues today as an MP. Improving opportunities and life chances for Black people is one of my key objectives. And Marielle was taken far too young, and I hope that the family get the justice they deserve, because justice delayed is a justice denied. But 4 years under Bolsonaro brought Brazil to its knees, and Lula has made significant advances, as we've heard, in housing, education, and tackling poverty and the environment. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that things will only get better under his presidency, but it's not going to be easy, because as we've heard, the right is still on his back. So thank you, comrades, and solidarity.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's always great to hear a first-hand account and to see practical solidarity in action, with the links between the Labour movement in the UK and in Brazil growing stronger every day. So thank you very much for that contribution. Next up, we have Juliana Moraes from the Washington, Brazil office. The Washington, Brazil office is an independent institution for the protection of human rights and the promotion of sustainable socio-economic development in Brazil. Juliana is in an excellent position to tell us about the steps being taken to transition Brazil towards a greener economy. Thank you so much for joining us, Juliana, and we were all really interested to hear what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Celia. Thank you so much for everybody for organizing this rally. I was reminded this morning of the many parties that we had exactly a year ago, and right the day before, on October 29th, I remember being in Avenida Paulista, the main avenue in São Paulo, and I had the chance to chat with Jeremy Corbyn for a bit as Lula was passing by on top of a truck. That was the last rally, and we were very anxious. We couldn't know by then what could happen. And just to echo what Julia has shared, like, so much has happened in the last almost year since the Lula government started, and it's really like a world of possibilities that we can think of, and of course continue working with other folks all over the world, because many problems in Brazil are very critical, of course, but are not independent. I mean, not unique to Brazil, right? Like many other countries experience that. So yeah, just to borrow a little bit of what the justice and environment agenda that Julia was mentioning, I will talk a bit on 3 different points, focusing on what has been spearheaded by the economic ministry and the industry and commerce ministry, which is to create new lines of energy transmission in the country, which means increasing even more that sort of infrastructure in the country, right? Which anyway would be focusing much more on not limiting investment or welcoming investment from outside, but also the private sector outside, meaning outside of Brazil, and also the private sector within Brazil. And a bit of the second point that I'm going to talk about has something to do with the decarbonization of Petrobras. As many people know, Petrobras is the oil giant of Brazil. And in the last 6 years, I would say, it had left behind a lot of research and development for, you know, continue to be expanding the oil and expanding other fronts so old in the 21st century. And finally, what I wanted to just, I will also bring up a little bit, is the fact that the climate crisis, the global climate crisis under Lula appears to me and some other analysts that it becomes an opportunity, right, for Latin America and the Caribbean region to leverage further integration, to be working together and to have an understanding and act upon the fact that it's the most diverse region of the world, a region that has fed the world for so many centuries, a resource-rich region that can also focus more and more with the fact that a lot of those resources can stay as well in the region, right? I'll talk very briefly about that in a second. But going back to Petrobras, what we see is that the research center with Petrobras, known to be like the most complex and richest research center for oil companies in the world, has now started to really green the oil giant, looking into how alternative sources of electricity can come about in the country. And that will be includes expanding wind energy in the country, solar energy, and most important, something that Lula had started in the early 2000s in his first government, was to provide subsidies for lower income folks to have solar panels in their countries. Something that today I see many countries in Europe that do that, have normalized that. Brazil was already doing in the early 2000s. I don't know how long has this countries in Europe been doing that, but we had this gap for many years that none of that was being done in Brazil. So we are now in a position to catch up with all the climate destructions that we've been having, and the fact that we were not following some of the most important agendas that we started and had, you know, as a nation and left. And on that sense, going back a bit to the transmissions and greening the energy sources, there's one example that came to my mind as I was preparing for this talk, which is a new car manufacturing in Brazil to produce electric cars. We still don't have that in Brazil, even though we have a lot of car manufacturing. And one interesting example is that so Ford still have many factories in Brazil, left one factory in Bahia in the years of the former government. And now, thanks to a lot of articulations from the current government, a lot of welcoming investment and increase in the legitimacy of the country everywhere, there will be the usage of the same infrastructure left by Ford will be used by one of the Chinese biggest car makers, electric car makers in the world, taking the same plants, the same issue. The same building. And one interesting aspect that I wanted to share is that this arrival of this factory, one of the conditions that were negotiated between both countries and between the companies, is that the factory will maintain Brazilian jobs. As most people know, unemployment has been still very high, but particularly in the last 6 years, unemployment became a huge issue in Brazil. So jobs will be maintained within the Brazilian workforce, and also the suppliers will be maintained within the Brazilian markets. And of course, it's also related to the fact that in Latin America, within the lithium triangle, There are many countries that are now trying to push for not to, how can I say, like to follow a bit of what Bolivia has been doing, to have a state level administration of their lithium resources, but also to push for more regulation of countries that have it privatized, like Chile, but also to produce the batteries in their own countries. And Brazil is having a really important role on that. Of course, Brazil does not have as much lithium as the neighbors in the southern cone, and Bolivia, but of course it's dealing with this integration and the importance of working together and keeping the resources there, and of course not rejecting the importance of dealing with climate change being global, but not continue to have this colonial role of just providing the resources everywhere, right? And I feel like why we need to talk about this, why this is important. I guess it goes back to what Julia was saying about the justice behind the energy transition, about the environment issues that Brazil goes under, and we need to look into job creation, technological transfer, and also like skill capacitating, training people to be working in new technologies, new infrastructures, while maintaining environmental conservation, while pushing forward green industrialization, right? So opposed to, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much as well, but like what I want to share on this front is that opposed to what was pushed by the far right government, like they openly would defend an agenda that was defended in the military rule that took place in Brazil from 1964 to 1985, the corporate military dictatorship, is that what Bolsonaro was doing was very much similar to that, expanding deforestation to record levels. And his vice president at the time, who was in charge of the environment agenda in the Amazon, used the same language as the militaries back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, which was to pave the roads of the Amazon. As many people know, the roads of the Amazon are mainly rivers. That's how the Amazon is connected. That's how commerce also works in the Amazon, right? So meaning that they were really expanding it. I mean, they have expanded, unfortunately, the soy market and many other destructions that has been happening. And of course, under Lula, we see already a reduction of 34% in the first 6 months of Lula in power. We see a reduction of 34% of deforestation in the Amazon, and really like bringing Brazil back to the 21st century, right? Like I was mentioning before. And the way that it can be done effectively, the way that it's being done effectively, what we can see is that not only climate change impacts the most vulnerable, energy transition or ecological transition is being called in Brazil right now. If it's not done with justice, if it's not a just transition, it will also affect the most vulnerable, which we see historically always like the working class and the people who are in more drought areas. Everything is just continue to be mostly affected. And of course, the indigenous peoples, the Ribeirinhas, the Quilombolas, and so forth. So it's so one interesting aspect on this is that CUT, the Unified Union Central, I guess I could translate that way, they have been in the forefront to ensure that the energy transition in Brazil takes into account the voice of the unions, the voice of the workers, and how to ensure that technological transfer takes into account with different training and different everything. And CUT has been organizing as well, like forums, discussions on how to, learn and exchange their own experience with unions in Europe, with unions in Asia and Africa as well. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, they held a forum in São Paulo about this. So and of course, as most folks know, probably CUT works very closely to the Workers' Party and has a way into pursuing the government as civil society organization as well as one of the biggest unions in the world to be influentiating their agenda. So basically, that's few of the things that I wanted to share here. And you know what we see from 1 year ago precisely is that beyond resuming research and development in Petrobras, beyond reduction of the deforestation in the Amazon, is that Lula's really seems to be intensifying an institutional change in the country in light of the climate crisis. Yeah, I think that's, you know, the transversal approach. Yeah, that's what I was going to share here. The transversal approach that we see is right before he took office, most people didn't know exactly how a transition agenda would be housed in which ministry. And it turned out to be in a very transversal manner. So we see, like I mentioned before, the economy ministry, the industry and commerce, but also science and technology, of course, the environment ministry, and planning ministry, which was extincted by the Bolsonaro government. The country was just going without much planning, which was very uncommon in Brazil. And taking into account as well the issues brought by the Ministry of Racial Equality, recently created by President Lula, the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, also recently created by government Lula, and many other areas that take into account the important issue of just transition in the country. So overall, in this past year, what we see, and myself as a Brazilian national, somebody who follows really often, tries to follow really often everything that happens there, it's like really us back in the 21st century, and the Lula's government allowing for that, allowing for us to see possibilities, given the geography of the country, giving all of the natural resources of how much can be done, not only, of course, again, not only for the country or for the region. Of course, it's already become a regional leader again on the environmental agenda, but like if there is good results in Brazil in terms of socioeconomic and environmental development, the whole world benefits from it. So it's really from an optimistic standpoint that I share this last couple of months. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, we do have many things that we need to continue to follow closely. There are pressures from all sides for things not to go as well as we would hope. But still, so far, everything has been really well in terms of the energy transition and just transition. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliana. And it's just so inspiring to hear some of those things that you've just told us about, the fact that there's been a 34% reduction in deforestation since Lula came to power is incredible. And also just heartening to know that the unions are central to that process of a just transition. So thank you very much for everything you've just told us about. So we're now coming to our final speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Francisco Dominguez. Francisco is the former head of Latin American Studies at Middlesex University, and as many of you know, is an expert on developments across the region. Francisco was also recently in Brazil, and I'm looking forward to hearing firsthand, Francisco, about your time there, and also about some of the regional contexts with the resurgence of progressive governments and movements in Latin America. So welcome, Francisco. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Celia. I want to congratulate the organizers. This is quite an important thing to do, is to evaluate the significance of, the re-election of Lula in this year. And the reason is the weight of Brazil, which I'll come back to in a minute. I was invited to São Luís de Maranhão in the northeast of Brazil, which is one of the poorest areas of the country, by the university there to an academic conference. And at this academic conference, normally I've been invited to that several times. They organize these conferences every 2 years. And normally you get 300 to 500 people who attend. On this occasion, the number of people who attended was 1,000. And you could see the spirit, the sense that I got from most of them very young people. I mean, I would say 95% of them were very young, students mainly. The sense that I got from them was we defeated Bolsonaro and we're beginning to see that what we wanted to do is beginning to happen. And there were discussions about all of these issues that we are discussing here. Because of time, I'm not going to dwell on them too much. There was a huge amount of sense of optimism, not only on the question of social development, not only on the question of social policy, but also in terms of regional integration, as well as environmental defense, which is quite strong. I mean, it's very, very strong in there. So I was delighted, to have been one of the keynote speakers at that meeting, and people were very interested and very engaging. And there is a new spirit, because I went there 2 years ago, and the atmosphere was very, very different. I remember vividly, everybody was somber, and, rightly so. So let me come back to the question of the weight of Brazil. The GDP of Brazil now is 2 trillion. That is huge. Brazil is about the 9th or 10th largest economy in the world. If you take the GDP of the whole of Latin America, the combined GDP of all of the Latin American countries, that comes down to 6 trillion. Brazil is 2 trillion out of that total. So that gives you an idea of the weight it is. So people like me, and I imagine presidents in the left in Latin America, there's few of them, must have been extremely delighted to know that now it is possible to engage very seriously in regional integration. Because it is possible to engage in regional integration without Brazil, but that is very difficult. But if you do it with Brazil on your side, then it's much easier in every possible sense. And I'll give you some examples. Brazil plays a central role in the BRICS. It's been there for a long time. And Lula made a proposal to the leadership of the BRICS. I don't know how decisions are made there, but definitely they have ways of doing it. And he made a proposal that he proposed a new person for the bank of the BRICS, which is called the New Development Bank. The New Development Bank has a working capital of 200 billion, which is mainly earmarked for infrastructural development, for anything that is going to benefit the country. So there is a huge fund which is available to all the countries that belong to it. And the proposal that Lula made was that the president of the New Development Bank was none other than Dilma Rousseff. And she is now the president of the New Development Bank. And you can imagine the significance that has, not only for the world as a whole, given the very progressive policies internationally, excuse me, of the Workers' Party and of the Brazilian government, but also to Latin America. In other words, these funds, I'm not saying everything is going to be for Latin America, but these funds can be made available for very important, necessary, and urgent development that the region needs. So that's number one. Lula's election has given a huge impetus to regional integration. For example, Lula already proposed the creation of a single currency for South America. A single currency which is not going to be like the euro. We're not going to make the mistake of producing something that doesn't work. They're working on it, and they're going to propose at some point the details of it. They're working on that. And the currency is being proposed that is called sur, which means south, which is, very appropriate. And is already discussing with Argentina to set up mutually these cryptocurrency for themselves so that they can engage in trade without having to resort to the dollar, which is extremely important. Lula has made several very strong statements over the past period regarding the absolute need not to have to depend on the dollar in order for countries to engage in transactions. There are two reasons for this. There are more, but I'll just concentrate on two. Number one, it's expensive. You have to pay commission. Why do we have to pay commission? Number two, you are given the country that is the owner of this currency enormous power to influence what you can do with third countries. So Lula is asking, why do I have to, talk to the United States when I want to engage in any business with anybody else? So therefore, de-dollarizing the world economy is an essential step towards building what the Global South called a multipolar world, world which engages in multipolarity. So this is already very important. And the level of trade between Brazil and Argentina is 2.2 billion. And the agreement is, at the moment, is that they settle their trade in the Chinese currency, the yuan, which is an extraordinary, interesting, and important development. So Lula has also agreed with China to settle their common trade in yuan. So from now on, when the two countries engage in trade, they're going to use the yuan as well as the real, the Brazilian currency, in order to settle, whatever needs to be paid. This is very important because annually, the value of the trade between Brazil and China is $150 billion, which is a huge amount. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, the GDP of the Nicaraguan economy is 14 billion. So this is more than 10 times that is going to be settled in a currency which is not the dollar, which is obviously going to significantly help the Global South for this. And there is an Argentinian agreement also with China to settle their trade in yuan with China. So in January this year, Argentina paid $1 billion in yuan to China. And then from there on, from May on, every month, Argentina, because it's got a very intense trade with China, is going to be paying in yuan the equivalent of $790 million in order to settle that trade with China. So basically, everything is being reoriented in a very interesting direction. Lula is also very keen to set up a Bank of the South. The proposal of the Bank of the South was made by Chavez back several years ago. And at the time, Lula was a bit lukewarm towards the proposal. In the electoral campaign, Lula made it clear that he had made a mistake by not taking this proposal seriously. Because if the South American countries, and then later on the whole of the Latin American countries, have their own bank, where all of them contribute part of their GDP to have resources available to them, what that will do is will make the World Bank and the IMF totally redundant. Therefore, it will reduce the capacity of the United States to weaponize, loaning money, borrowing money whenever any country have any problems, and our countries depend very heavily on the exploitation of raw materials. And this fluctuate very widely all the time in the world market. So therefore, we're always vulnerable to being hit by these fluctuations. And the final point I want to make two final points. The first one is this initiative by Lula to defend the Amazon is already called a conference of all 8 countries that have part of their territory in the Amazon. Brazil is the most important one. The proportion of the Amazon that is part of the Brazilian territory is 62%. So that gives you an idea of how big it is. The second one is Peru, which is 11, and then it goes down all the way down from there. Bolivia is part of it, Venezuela, Colombia, Suriname, Guyana, and Ecuador. And this is a very important initiative because for the first time, there is the possibility of organizing a collective defense of the environment through governments which commit themselves to specific policies, which are going to have enormous significance because Latin America, this is going to take place in a context where Latin America is seeking to regionalize, to integrate regionally. And just to give you a flavor of how this is being perceived, there was a report which was a bit of an analysis by the World Bank, and the title of the World Bank article, which was in July, on the 5th of July 2023, that is to say recently, it says this: 8 Amazonian countries with the power to save the planet. That is really what is posed. So this is a fantastic development, and without Brazil, I don't think, and without Lula, put it more precisely, I don't think it would have been possible. But the final point I want to make is this: even though things are quite positive in all sorts of respects, there are also tremendous dangers. It's extremely difficult to win elections for the left. We have seen the defeat again of the left in Ecuador. We have seen that in Brazil, there is extreme right-wing organizations, militia people, and so on, who are prepared to cause all sorts of, mischief. We have seen how difficult it has been in many other countries. We have seen that there has been a coup d'etat in Peru. So although there are positive developments, the aggressiveness of the powers that be has also grown in intensity. We've seen their activity in the rest of the world, certainly in Palestine is an indication of that. So we are going to need much more solidarity than ever, because everything that they do, and I don't mean only economically, but everything they're able to do in order, for example, to save the planet and to have a better world, a multipolar world, is going to benefit people in the UK as well as in Europe. And we want you people to win elections. So please do as we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. It's fascinating to hear about those economic proposals and the impact that they might have not only in Brazil, but in the region as a whole. And thank you also for reminding us of the need for ongoing solidarity with Brazil and with Lula. So sadly, that brings us to the end of our evening and our rally tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I want to echo the thanks to the organisers of tonight's meeting. Thank you very much for putting on a really fantastic panel of speakers. Please do check the links in the chat that Patrick has posted. If you're in a trade union or a community organisation, please do ask those groups to affiliate to the Brazil Solidarity Initiative. Please make a donation if you can afford to do so, and please follow them on social media. So if you're, let's all continue to take inspiration from Brazil and show our support for Lula, and keep building solidarity with all those who are fighting to protect the Amazon, to hold the far right to account, and to rebuild equality and social progress after Bolsonaro's disastrous rule. Thank you and good night. Thanks for joining us.